Okay, perfect. So well, we can start the session. So welcome everyone to this special session of our internal seminar on philosophy of mind at the Instituto Investigaciones Filosóficas in Argentina, hosted by SADAF and CONICET. This is a special session because in general it's private, and this time is going to be open to the public. First, because we have special guests, and second, because Diana and Antoni just published a book on the second person, and this is a kind of tribute to their work. Well, the speakers are going to be Diana and Antoni, who are going to do one presentation. Diana Pérez is a full professor of metaphysics and philosophy of mind at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Buenos Aires. And she's also a distinguished researcher at the Instituto Investigaciones Filosóficas, where we have the seminar in Argentina. Antoni Gomila, who has a background in philosophy, he's currently a full professor of psychology at the psychology department of the University of the Balearic Islands in Spain. And he works at the intersection of philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science. And finally, Leonhard Schilbach, I hope that I pronounced well the name. He's a psychiatrist, the head of the Department for General Psychiatry at the LVR Clinicum at Düsseldorf. And he's also a professor of psychiatry at the Ludwig Maximilians in Munich, Germany, a faculty member of the International Max Planck Research School for Translational Psychiatry, and an associate faculty member at the Graduate School of Systematic Neuroscience, both in Munich. So we are going to proceed as follows. Diana and Antoni are going to do a presentation together. Then you can ask questions if you have very specific questions about the talk. All the topics to discuss, we'll leave it to the end. Then Leonhard is going to present and give his talk, and we are going to proceed in a similar way. And finally, we open the discussion to the public. So Diana, Antoni, you can start.
Okay, thank you. Diana asked me to make the presentation. She will answer the questions, especially the difficult ones. Well, let me say first that I'm very happy that we can share this session with Leonhard. I began writing in the second person back in the early 2000, the new century, but I think that this wouldn't have been possible without Leonhard's work from neuroscience, proving somehow that the interaction takes a different way of working than just observational standard models of attribution holding at that time. So we are grateful for his contribution, and I think it's very important in helping to go through these sort of ideas. Well, this is the book, but we will just focus on second person attribution, which I think is our contribution try to contribute as a different or as a particular way of seeing how interaction works. This is the essential point, and in this presentation we'll focus just on that and how we propose, how we analyze what's involved in second person interactions, which are this sort of special face-to-face as we now see. But the point is that these interactions, when they are not just physical or in terms of movement, but when they are intentional, they are mediated by a special kind of attribution, that psychological attribution that we call second personal, and that we will try to explain what are the features that distinguish them from other forms of psychological attribution. The second thesis is that these attributions are possible because there's been a selective pressure to make us, our mentalities, readable or expressed publicly available exactly for mediating interaction. This is a part on expression that the book develops, and will not dwell here in detail. But I think that it's important to realize that what we say about the second person has to do with the side of the attribution, has to do with the fact that there is a lot of use of information to be meaningful perceived by the attributee, so that the attribution is possible. The third idea is that this is quite different from first and third person attributions in different ways, in that sort of contents, in that the second person attributions are not propositional content attributions, which were the standard model of psychological attribution for many years. But what we add here is that second person attributions constitute the ground for the development of our understanding of mentality, is the way through which we grasp mental state concepts. This is not something we're going to treat here, but I think this is Diana's stronghold, so I invite difficult questions for her about this. And the final thesis that we developed in a chapter in the book is the evidence that avails or provides that supports this proposal, that the proposal tries to account for that the evidence is very wide and extended at that night and at this time, and it's going beyond and beyond. I think this is a hot topic at the moment, but the critical issue, as I said at the beginning, was the proof that the brain circuits involved in when we are interacting and trying to make sense of another person in interaction are quite different, not completely different, but different from the circuits that are involved in theory of mind classical tasks of propositional content attributions. And as well, the evidence is accumulating that these abilities may be impaired and developed as are important in development, but may be impaired in different ways, and especially in autism and we were talking just a moment ago, and the psychiatric disorders. Just for reminder, maybe all you have already heard about second person interactions. We try to, in the book, we try to be clear on second person interaction and second person attribution as what mediates second person interaction. But we start trying to characterize second person interactions as interactions, a special subset of social interactions that involve typically body to body or face to face, or some form of direct information in action situations that may be cooperative or competitive, symmetrical or asymmetrical, as in the case of the baby with the mother, and with a purpose in mind, or that have to be or has to be developed as a common purpose or not, or with some interest or not, or it's more. So there are a whole bunch of possibilities here. What's important is that what distinguishes this interaction from mere physical interactions or more higher level forms of interaction with a common plan is previously distributed or agreed on, is that the interaction takes place through the mediation of an implicit form of psychological attribution. Basically, we focus on intentions and emotions as those sort of states that can be that fulfill the conditions or the characteristics of second person attributions. The characteristics are the following. This is what I'm going to focus, just to present briefly these features, try to introduce them and motivate them, and having in mind that it's for this sort of situations and sustained by some brain circuits. Now, the first idea is that these sort of attributions are implicit. This is in contrast with explicit attributions. Explicitness is connected to awareness. This is not required here. Something may be implicit in that it shows in the behavior. So in these examples, for instance, we need to exhibit our behavior or the behavior of one agent. The agent has to attribute some sort of intention or some sort of plan or an emotional state to the other agent. And even if it has not done explicitly, it's not articulated verbally, and nothing mediates or nothing explicitly communicated. And this implicitness it goes deeper. It needs to be developed, and not something simple, but it's the first thing to keep in mind. We are not saying that we, in these situations, are mediated by explicit attributions. The second feature is that it's a sort of practical knowledge, a sort of know-how, not a know-thou. Know that. Second-person attributions are a form of a kind or a particular form of social cognition. Is a deployment of knowledge that we have about other people. It's just that it's not knowledge that we have in the form of declarative knowledge, but in the form of practical, the way it shows up in the way we deal with others. And as in other characteristics, in general, what's typical of know-how is that it's context dependent, and it's obtained or also dependent on past history of interaction. So we may be more competent at interacting with some other agent. We have a previous history of interaction than with somebody that we just met. The third characteristic, it has to do with the semantics of the attribution. And we argue that these attributions are transparent, and it's different or opposed to opaque attributions. It's like a classical point in semantics and in theory of mind debates to start from introducing this concept of semantically opacity, which means that co-referential expressions do not cannot be substituted salva veritate. We can say that, I don't know, Diana thinks that the best man in this audience is blonde, and maybe there is another way to describe this person that she is not aware of. So if we attribute to her this belief, we cannot substitute this expression with another one with the same reference. But with second person attributions, we can, because what we argue is that these attributions are related in a sort of deictic tracking to some element in the common area of space of interaction. And it's not committed to, these attributions are not committed to capture how the partner in the interaction conceives of that element that is just related to the element. That's for the content, but also for the this is connects with the sort of states that can be attributed in second person attributions. We are typically not beliefs, of course, but more basic mental states that can be just objectual rather than propositional. This I would say that almost all of the previous writing on psychological attribution took for granted that attributions have to be of propositional attitudes. And as I said in the beginning, this is also in the characterization of the attributions, the information that grounds the attribution is public. This is connected to the expressive dimension of our psychology, the fact that through the body, mental states have been conceived in the Cartesian tradition as something inner and private and hidden, and maybe something that we can just get at through inference in a sort of theoretical way. And against these views, we argue that the attributions are based on the bodily dimension, bodily expression of mental states. Of course, not all mental states. The scope of second person attributions is restricted and gets to what it can get, but still it's important to leverage our conceptual system. In the book, we reconstruct elements in the evolution of social species that show the importance of increasing the conspicuousness and richness of the expressive cues. The next feature is that the attributions are direct. It's a form of meaningful perception. We are not attributing psychological states through an inference or by a process of imagination, of analogical projection from one to another, but given the expressive dimension of mental states, we are able to recognize them, perceive them meaningfully. Of course, this happens at the personal level. At the subpersonal level, unconscious processing of these expressive cues, there can be complex processes. But at the personal level, what we realize that we see the love, or we see the happiness, or we see what's the intention of our partner in interaction. Very much as we hear meanings, we don't hear frequencies, we don't hear wavelengths, and then make inferences to find out what those sounds may mean. We just hear the meanings. Of course, by mediation of a sort of specialized knowledge that we have acquired in development, that's similar for the second person attributions. And emotions are prototypical in this area, and there are a couple of chapters on that. There are two final features of the second person attributions that are also, I would say, differential in our proposal from other people that have written on second person. The first is that we emphasize the reciprocally contingency of these attributions. Being in a second person interaction, it means that what you are as an agent as a partner in the interaction, you need to make sense of the behavior of the other person in intentional terms, and you do with the characteristics, but at the same time, the other partner has to do the same. And it generates a pattern of mutual attributions that are very time sensitive to very short time spans, and are based on the integration of what I'm doing with what I'm perceiving the other to do. And in this way, the second person perspective involves some sort of privilege access to information that you cannot, that the partner in the interaction is in that privileged position to acquire, because what you need to do is to realize that what you are perceiving is contingent on what you are doing, and you need to integrate both, and in a dynamical way. And in the initial efforts at second person interaction has focused mostly on synchrony, but I think this emphasis on synchrony misses the dynamic dimension of the interaction. The interactions are not fixed or momentarily, but they developed in time, and this depending on these mutual attributions. And finally, the final feature is that we are, by default, we are programmed to enjoy interacting with others. And probably Leonhard will illustrate that more deeply on what this means, and I think that the reward system in the brain is activated by default and so we are made to enjoy the emotional engagement or the development of a common focus or a common action with others. And this is important in our lives, very important. And this is what maybe the most important source of value in our lives, as it provides bonds, affiliation, attachment to others. This is also something that requires development, but I think for the current purposes is enough. The other thesis, as I said, is that second person attributions are basic, and this means that they are the first one that developed in ontogeny. It's our entry point to the world of mentality to make sense of intentionality. It's also probably has precedent phylogenetically, but also conceptually. And this is the critical issue, and something else of the needs requirement. And there's a chapter on how to make sense of the development of the concept of belief, for instance, or the concept of the attribution of epistemic states, and what's before that, and how we become able to attribute propositional contents. And in fact, we argue that the other forms of psychological attribution are grounded in this one, and so appear lately and develop through the conceptual resources that we acquire in this way. But of course, in real life, both or all of them are mixed, and we can combine them. And we also included a chapter on how the different perspectives can be activated at the same time in situations of interaction. So we are not hardliners on second person saying that that's all that we need to account for social interaction. It's the basic element, but it's not the only one. And of course, we are able of third person attributions as well, propositional contents, of course. And we also try to relate the second person attribution to the view of the cognition of the mind as embodied, and also all this is that's how trendy, but we try to apply this thesis in a special way. And we have tried to apply this in interpreting that also psychological evidence, and to show precisely how I think this idea can also help to account for debates or solve debates that have been very, very hotted in psychology of development, for instance, or in comparative psychology. So just in case anyone is in the audience is interested on that. And the final point is that, as being a book on the second person, it's been a great pleasure to work with Diana also in Mallorca, as we see. It's been a long project, but it's been one enjoyable. It's so in a way it's a pity that it just finished, but also it's well, much needed, at least for me. Okay, and then I think that for starters, I think can be enough. I'm gonna stop sharing the. Back to you, Marina.
Well, thank you, Antoni, for the presentation. Thank you very much. So if someone has a very specific question to ask, that's the time. And if not, if it's more a general question and you want to discuss, we can just do it later. I don't know. If someone has a question, you can raise your hand.
No, we can wait.
Okay, so maybe, yes, Leonhard can just start.
Okay.
There is one question someone just raised there. Her hand, Flora. So if you want to ask the question. I think maybe she didn't realize that she raised her hand. Mm-hmm. Well, you are on mute. I think you can unmute yourself, right?
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. I enjoyed very much. I have a question relating to the knowledge how or know-how earlier in your presentation. You said that the second person attribution involves some specific know-how rather than know that. I suppose what you mean is that it involves some kind of knowledge how rather than knowledge that. As far as I know, the definition of knowledge how changes or varies among scholars. So I want to know the definition of know-how that you take place.
Well, Tony is not there, so I will try to answer. We don't have a definition. We didn't provide a definition. We just want to highlight the fact that there's no, you don't have to manage any propositional rule or content or knowledge in order to make this kind of attributions. That's the idea. You don't have to ground the attribution in explicit knowledge. That's why we use the expression know-how instead of know that. I don't know if that's what you were asking for or something more specific. We didn't provide the definition.
Well, thank you, Diana. So I don't know if Diana answered your question, Flor. And well, if not, we can discuss this later. So Leonhard, you can start your presentation.
Perfect. Now it should work. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. I also have to say thanks for receiving this in the mail. Yeah, so it did arrive and I'm very grateful. So thank you so much. Also for the kind words at the beginning. So I'm clearly not a philosopher. and I'm not even a scientist. I'm a medical doctor who started thinking about social interaction when I was training as a psychiatrist some years ago by now. And I wanted to learn more and understand my patients better. And that's why I got interested in thinking about social interaction, what they mean, how they might be relevant for mental health, for psychiatry, etc. And I've basically stuck with this topic of investigation and research for a number of years now. And I just wanted to basically try and give you an overview of some of the research that I've been involved with over the years, which sort of empirically focuses on social interactions, what the underlying behavioral and neuromechanisms may be, and how that relates to psychiatry. Probably quite a different talk from the one that you've just heard, but hopefully, and I think that there are also some similarities, at least conceptually, in some of the things that I'm going to tell you. So this would be sort of my overview of the talk. So at the beginning, I just wanted to briefly say why I think it's important to very closely link psychiatry and social interactions, how this may lead to some new ideas for research in the field of social neuroscience, and then give you some examples of the studies that I've been involved with over the years, and then finally at the end sort of come back to the clinical work and tell you a little bit about how I view psychiatric disorders and what we do in order to support persons affected by mental illness. But to start with, I mean, this is sort of me, the psychiatrist, teasing the philosophers. Yeah, can we know other minds? Of course, I mean, all of you know much more about this from a conceptual point of view. I just sort of use this for my clinical work. Yeah, I try to put myself into other person's shoes. I try to understand patients, etc., etc. But these are just sort of this is my icebreaker slide, if you like. So I like this. Sometimes we want to know, or sometimes we're led to believe that people think certain things, and then it turns out that people think something completely different. So that's important to keep in mind. I always tell my patients this. Another thing that I find a bit amusing is this one. So there are some persons who in psychiatry, we say, suffer from social anxiety, and they worry a lot about what other people think. So socially anxious persons, they're afraid of being judged by others negatively. And I always say, oh, don't worry, it's not a problem. People don't think very much, unless of course they're philosophers. But then, you know, how often are you in the presence of many philosophers? So it's not that dangerous in real life, I would say. But anyways, and then when I sort of got deeper into this field, I was also helped by philosophers and psychologists, so a very sort of close collaborator and sort of philosopher that I know well is Tobias Schlicht, who was involved in a project, and then Bert Timmermans was a psychologist. And we sort of started discussing these different spectatorial accounts of social cognition that Antoni also already alluded to. So the idea, how does it really work? Yeah. When we try to understand other people, and there were these sort of two dominant views, something that's described as simulation theory. So I use my own mental states and then project them onto another person in order to understand that person's behavior, as compared to this sort of theory approach, which suggests that I need to posit mental states as entities and then use them in order to understand behavior. Both of them, of course, suggest that there's this epistemic gap between myself and the other person that needs to be bridged by some mechanisms of inference, let's say. And we said, well, if there's a first person simulationist account and a third person account of social cognition, almost by logical necessity, there should be a second person account. Yeah, and our, let's say, very loose starting intuition was this one. So when we started doing these kinds of studies, we thought our intuition is that social cognition is fundamentally different when we are in touch, in interaction with other people, when we are emotionally engaged with them. So this difference that you might describe as social cognition from an interactor's point of view, as compared to social cognition from an observer's point of view. And I suppose that sort of resonates quite well with what Antoni has described before. And what we've seen, so we then said, well, isn't it interesting to see that this field of social neuroscience that tries to find out what the neural basis of social interaction really is, has found this very difficult to do. And we, by way of metaphorically speaking, suggested that there's actually a dark matter of social neuroscience, which you can see on the top left. So we tried to dissect the kind of experimental approaches that were used in social neuroscience across different dimensions. So we said, does an experimental task that is used in research really look at social interaction or rather observation? So this is this dimension that we call participation. And then another dimension that we thought was important was the emotional experience. So am I emotionally engaged with another person that I see or not? And of course, you can see how systematically you can vary experimental tasks to study social cognition according to these different dimensions. So you can study a dynamic interaction, but this may be one where you are not emotionally engaged. So let's say if I get on the bus in the morning and talk to the bus driver, it's an interaction, it's dynamic, it's real, but I'm not as emotionally engaged as when in the evening I'm interacting with my son, for instance. Yeah, so there are these differences which might be important in order to dissect and understand what's really happening and what mechanisms underlie these different kinds of interactions. And the interesting finding in 2013 was that social neuroscience had found it really hard to study the most interesting case. So the dynamic social interactions where there's also emotional engagement. Yeah, so what social neuroscience really wanted to understand are those cases, and those were sort of very difficult to tackle for methodological reasons, but also conceptually, because the second person idea at the time had not been, let's say, as dominant or as present in the research, because many researchers said, well, we don't really care so much for social interactions. It's hard, to do this kind of work. And what's really nice is that over the years, and this is from a review article that I've written 2 years ago for a journal, we see that now more and more studies really look at these differences in systematic ways. And it turns out, as Antoni already mentioned, that there are important differences. Yeah, so real-time interactive tasks, social interactions work differently, different brain regions are recruited, brain connectivity differences exist, etc., etc. So it really turns out that there's evidence which speaks for a second-person neuroscience, if you like. So if we want to study the social brain, a truly social brain, then this is what we need to do. And I think that that's sort of a very interesting development that we've seen. With regard to psychiatry, this is just a psychiatrist talking here. So why is it important to think about psychiatric disorder? It's important because they're on the rise. Yeah, and this is already from 3 years ago. Again, this Lancet Commission report, which suggested that every country in the world, already then before the pandemic, is facing and failing to tackle a mental health crisis. So we are seeing increasing numbers of mental health problems, and this is now exacerbated even more by the pandemic, which has increased sort of levels of anxiety and depression even more. And then the question was, why is this, and why are we not stopping this crisis? And then one person from this commission in the press conference said, well, that's probably related to the fact that mental ill health is much more complex than broken bones. Yeah, and that's true, of course, but it's also a bit trivial to say this. And of course, what we should do is learn more about mental health and what we can do to help people stay healthy, or when they have a mental health issue, how they can recover. And a very important strategy in psychiatry has been this one, to treat psychiatric disorders as brain disorders. And this is sort of a long-standing tradition. So this guy on the top left you see is Wilhelm Griesinger, so an old German psychiatrist from the 1900s, who already suggested that we should think about the brain. And this has been a very, let's say, dominant strategy. So you can see here Hyman, a former NIMH director in the US, who also suggested mental illnesses are real, diagnosable, treatable brain disorders. Yeah, so a very stark statement. And the idea is, of course, that they were trying to establish some kind of mapping between the psychiatric disorder and some, let's say, brain abnormality that might be the underlying sort of substrate of that. And this has turned out to be, let's say, informative for research, but it hasn't been helpful in the clinical context, because this kind of research 150 years later has not produced a single brain-based biomarker that we could reliably use in the clinic. None. Nothing has sort of come out of this research. And this is something that Thomas Insel, sort of the successor of Hyman at the NIMH, realized. And Thomas Insel suggested that we need to do something different. So he said, we need to correct this idea, this mapping between psychiatric disorders and the brain by way of intermediate constructs, psychological constructs. And I think that this is a very smart suggestion, but of course it begs the question, what are those constructs and what should we really focus on? And then after proposing this great change at the NIMH, Thomas Insel did something interesting. He left. He left the NIMH and said, I'm not doing this anymore. And he was interviewed and people were perplexed and said, so why are you leaving now? And he said, well, I spent some time at the NIMH. It was great. I got a lot of cool papers published, spent $20 billion. But the problem is it hasn't mattered for clinical psychiatry. Nothing has changed. And that, of course, is a dramatic statement, I would say, particularly for a person who is in his kind of a position. So the question then becomes, so how can we do better? And our idea, or the idea in my research group over the years, has been to focus on what we call interaction-based phenotyping. So how can we try to address, assess, evaluate, and also measure social interactions in a more let's say, specific and subtle way in order to relate these kinds of measurements then later on also to something that we might be able to find at the level of the brain. And the idea here is basically that we want to focus on quantitative measures of social interaction rather than social observation, and then sort of try to translate them to underlying mechanism. And the idea would be also to say, studying social interaction more closely could serve as a calibration device for social neuroscience. So social neuroscience should be guided by this focus on social interaction rather than social observation, because this might help us to get closer to some of the relevant mechanisms and how this may translate then also into a clinical context. So my idea, so as a very, let's say, strong statement, would be to say, let's forget about diagnostic entities in psychiatry and let's focus on the social dimension, on social impairments, on social difficulties, and try to find ways in which we can then distinguish or stratify different groups of individuals whose needs for help, for support, for training, for all the things that psychiatry and related fields might offer may differ quite extensively based on the analysis of what they find difficult in a social interaction. That would be sort of in a schematic way something that I've tried to argue for in the past. And something that I also find very important is that when you think about social interaction, you also notice that it's not enough to think about individual brains. And we use this kind of schematic to explain why this might be. So in the middle, you see this sort of typical case that is often referred to in biological psychiatry. So you will have two persons, and then one person's brain is different. Let's say, because of some kind of a mental health issue. And due to this difference in that one person's brain, the social interaction doesn't work anymore. Let's say this is an autistic person. But what this kind of logic doesn't address is that you can theoretically think of a situation where you have two persons of the same kind, with the same kind of, let's say, statistical variance from the normal population, but who, when they are interacting, might actually have no problems in a social interaction. And this is something that we find when we do a group-based psychotherapy with adults with autism, for instance. And I'll tell you a little bit about this later on. So whether or not a social interaction works is also a question of the matching of the two persons. So how across the two individuals things may be similar or different, and this will also affect whether social interactions work or not. So after these sort of introductory comments, now some of the empirical stuff, and please do interrupt me or let me know if some of this is, let's say, completely foreign or I'm not explaining it well. So one thing that we did was we've wanted to find a way to measure dyadic social interactions in a real life kind of setting. And so the first thing we did was to run a pilot study where we established a setup that uses infrared motion sensors that you may know from video games. Yeah, so some of these newer video game consoles have these infrared motion trackers so that you can stand in front of the machine, move your body, and then the machine will register that you're moving and will use this information as an input. Yeah, let's say to play a game, let's for instance play tennis or something like this. And we use these sensors to measure the body motion of two persons who are interacting. And we, of course, had to give the people a reason to interact, and we asked them to play a game, yeah, which in German we call Zitternix. So in English, that would be keep it steady. So you have on the table this bundle of wooden sticks that you're supposed to manipulate either in a cooperative fashion or competitive. So you try to pull these sticks out so that when the other person in the competitive condition takes its turn, the bundle will break down and then you win, something like this. And we used this so that we had a more or less standardized, let's say, social interaction situation. And what you can then do is you use the motion tracking sensors to record data and then use a machine learning model to fit a skeleton model into these persons. And this is actually something that comes with these sensors. So this was not developed by ourselves, but this is something that Microsoft can give you, yeah, because they've established this for commercial purposes for video games. But what's really nice is you can use these skeleton models to track the behavior, and you can of course also relate the behavior of person A to the behavior of person B. You could also do things like estimate where people are looking. So you see here, sort of in the skeleton model, you have this one line that sticks out of the head. And this is an approximation of the gaze trajectory. Yeah, so based on the head position, you can infer where the person must be looking. And then you can sort of establish different measures of interpersonal coordination, if you like. So you can, for instance, measure whether the people are looking at one another, so whether they're establishing eye contact, or whether their gaze deviates, yeah, from looking directly at the other person. You can also look at interpersonal synchrony, so whether the behavior of person A and B is sort of synchronized, given certain temporal lags. And you can also look at the interpersonal distance. So are they close to one another? Do they move further apart as the interaction goes on, etc.? And finally, you can also look at something that we call joint orienting. So you can basically generate a plot which tells you how much time people spend during this interaction in either eye contact, yeah, so when the gaze is sort of fixating the other person, and this is true for both people, or when they are looking at the table, yeah, looking at this wooden, at this bundle of wooden sticks. So this is something that we described as joint attention, because they're both looking at the object on the table, and you can across time sort of calculate how much time they spend in these different states. So you get sort of something like a fingerprint of the interaction, yeah, how this was structured. In a video, it looks like this. Hopefully you can also see this on your screens. I don't know, but let's hope this works. So you can see how basically over time the tracking is running and how these different plots are basically generated. Yeah, and you can sort of do this for each diet. So for each interaction pair, and then after the experiment, of course, we asked different questions. So we asked people to rate their subjective experience of what it was like to play this game, and we then interrogated whether there are correlations between the subjective evaluations and the motion tracking. And we can interestingly find such correlations. So for instance, the diets which indicated that they really enjoyed playing the game, those were also the ones that were sitting closely together. Yeah, so interpersonal distance was much lower for these diets that expressed sort of enjoyment during the social interaction. And then you can also look at other measures, so how close they fell to one another, how much effort they spend to play this game really well. And we also asked about autistic traits. So these were healthy individuals without a psychiatric diagnosis, but who filled out this autism quotient self-report questionnaire. And we were able to see that the autistic traits do not matter very much during the game, interestingly, but only during the breaks. So you see here the between trial segments, and you see that the persons who are high in autistic traits, they increase interpersonal distance when they don't know what to do. Yeah. So when they are waiting for the next round, this is when they increase the distance, which fits very nicely also with my clinical experience with adults with autism, who, when they're high functioning, can follow instructions very well. But when they're uncertain, when it's not clear what I'm supposed to do, this is when the autism becomes much more, let's say, obvious. Yeah, and this already seems so. A similar kind of thing seems to be the case here in this sort of healthy cohort that is playing this game. Another kind of study that we've done is using sort of a two-person psychophysiology setup. So this works in such a way that we have two people who are sitting in front of each other, but who have computer screens in the middle, so that we can also show them some stimuli. But what's nice about this setup that a PhD student of mine generated is that we have these little micro cameras that are glued to the middle of the screen, so that you can get a live image of the other person and you can actually have eye contact. Yeah, so contrary to Skype and Zoom, etc., here we have a situation where I look at the screen, but I can look into the eyes of the other person. Yeah. And then sort of process the stimuli that are also shown on the screen. And we did this because we wanted to see what happens in a situation when the tasks, so the stimuli that you're supposed to process, were physically not discernible, and where the gaze of the other person might matter. Yeah, because maybe the other person knows what to do, and you can sort of look at the gaze behavior of the other person to understand which of the stimuli you're supposed to select. And those were the kinds of stimuli we used, so-called Gabor patches. And this was sort of an odd one out paradigm. So you always had to indicate the side, right, left, top, or bottom, which included the odd one out. But we had trials in which there was no target, and where only the gaze behavior of the other person was, let's say, of interest. And what we also did was we used a video delay system so that we could break the reciprocity of the social interaction. Yeah, so in the live video case, I see the other person in real time and I can see where he or she is looking. But in this delay situation, I still see a video image, but this is the other person from 10 seconds ago. So the reciprocity is broken, yeah, in this situation. So it's sort of a unidirectional situation. And we wanted to do this to very, let's say, precisely test this idea that a second person contingency might be important and would fundamentally change what will happen to what people experience and how they behave. And this, interestingly, is exactly what happens. So what we see here across a suite of studies is that this online as compared to this offline situation, it has a profound impact on how much people select the same object. So if you remember, there were 4 different possibilities. So at guessing rate, you would have a 25% rate of selecting one of these four objects together with the other person. And you can see here that across these different experimental conditions, the decision-making agreement goes up. So when people are in a reciprocal exchange, they sort of tend to agree. Yeah, they use behavior to somehow select the same objects, even though in this particular task, they weren't able to communicate verbally, yeah, because they had headphones on, so they could only use gaze. And we didn't even tell them, yeah, that they were supposed to do this, because we told them you select your stimulus by yourself, and the other person is also doing this. But still, people can't help but coordinate their gaze behavior. And interestingly, the decision-making alignment and the gaze behavior correlations are also closely linked. So you can see this here. To the extent to which the gaze behavior of the two interaction partners gets more similar, the decision-making alignment goes up. And this is sort of particularly pronounced as we suggested in the online conditioned where there's reciprocal exchange. So that's sort of one big outcome from this particular study. Just a brief question, how am I doing on time? Just to be sure.
Yes, if you, I don't know.
I have a few more minutes.
Okay. I think it's okay, right? I don't know.
I just want to make sure that I'm not going completely overboard. So then, so that's sort of one, let's say, set of studies. The other studies that we are doing or have been involved with over the years are basically neuroimaging studies, where we also wanted to look at the reciprocity of social interaction and what it means for the recruitment of different, for instance, brain regions. And so basically take this step from studies that in the past have really focused on non-interactive stimuli. So I'm in the MRI machine, I see a photo of a person smiling, and then we look at the brain responses that this elicits. So this would be something also in the paper that we described as a third person approach, yeah, to the social brain. And then moving forward from this to more second person approaches, where the idea is that you have an interactive stimuli. So I'm still in an MRI machine, which of course is a highly artificial environment, but the question is, how can I generate a task which recreates some of the important features of a second person scenario, yeah, in particular the reciprocity of the social interaction. And one way in which we've done this is by using eye tracking. So an eye tracker can basically assess where people are looking on the screen. And one thing that we've developed over the years is to have computer algorithms that can very quickly, in a matter of milliseconds, analyze this gaze data. So the algorithm detects where people are looking and can then change what people are seeing on the screen. And our first approach was to use these virtual characters. So these virtual agents that look a bit like humans. So sometimes these are described as anthropomorphic virtual agents, and we can make these agents responsive. Yeah, so the algorithm can change the behavior of this agent contingent upon where the study participant is looking. So for instance, the agent can respond when the person looks at the agent and looks back, yeah? Similar to how this may happen if you meet a real person, or if I always give this example, if I'm on the subway, I just need to look at another person long enough. Chances are very high this person will look back at me, yeah? Because humans are extremely sensitive to gaze cues, etc. And then you can sort of use this to systematically manipulate the kind of gaze behavior that this agent showed. And we have a number of studies sort of using this kind of task. But a common criticism of the reviewers was always, this is a computer agent. People will notice it's not a real person. And so a postdoc in my lab took on the challenge of improving this kind of a task by using real life videos. So now we are using these video snippets. This is Marie-Louise Brandi, the postdoc, and these are just recorded little video pieces of Marie where she's looking straight ahead or looking right, left or looking right. And together with this eye tracking algorithm, we can use these video snippets in such a way that it looks for people as if they were in a situation where they see Marie-Louise live. And of course, we tell them before participating in the study, we introduce Marie-Louise, and then through this, we tell them this will be a gaze-based social interaction through a video system, while in fact, we are only using the gaze behavior of the study participant to then create these changes in the gaze behavior. And we are using this because such an approach you can also use in the MRI machine and then do functional neuroimaging. So we did a study where we basically used this task, but where we also included an interpersonal stress scenario. So we asked people before they came into the lab to tell us about interpersonally stressful life events. So for instance, fighting with a partner or breaking up with another person, something like this, because we wanted to know what this does to the social interaction, in particular at the neural level. So what happens with my behavior and my brain when I'm going into a social interaction and when I'm stressed before by some kind of a social event, let's say. And this is sort of the study that we did to address this question. And of course, afterwards, we tested whether people were actually stressed by being remembered of these kind of situations. And this, in fact, was true. So you can see that different measures, so subjective reports of stress, so arousal, tension, etc., goes up when we tell people while they're in the scanner, now remember this time when you had this difficulty with your partner or something like this. So this has a strong effect on people's subjective experience. And then, of course, we do the social interaction task and can look at the brain data to see how this is reflected at the level of the brain. Before coming to this is a first very interesting result. So if we just look at social interaction in the scanner, yeah, and we just tell people, this is Marie-Louise Brandi, you have different objects on the screen that you can look at, and then you can see whether Marie-Louise also is interested to look at one of them. If you just ask people to participate in such a gaze-based social interaction, what you do is you activate basically all the social brain areas that have been documented over and over again, in particular, the so-called mentalizing network. Yeah, so you see here a medial prefrontal cortex, medial parietal cortex, so in the back where it says precuneus, you also see the temporoparietal junction area. So these are all areas that in the beginning of social neuroscience were related to explicit mental state attribution. Yeah, so these are areas that were first described when people used these very classical theory of mind tasks, where people said, now think about what John thinks when he has, a certain kind of a scenario. So similar to the example that Antoni also gave. Yeah, so explicit mental state attribution. But what we see is that it's not necessary, to ask someone for explicit mental state attribution to activate these areas. But it's simply by asking them to participate in a social interaction that this brain system is robustly activated. And this, of course, I think raises very interesting questions that Antoni also alluded to, in particular, the developmental trajectory. Yeah. So how is it that these brain networks are trained, let's say, during childhood and adolescence, and when do they start being used, let's say, also for more explicit forms of mental state attribution? Yeah. So this is something that a second person neuroscience, I think, will be able to address in the future. But it's a very, I think, very important finding, which we also described as a preview. So this was more of an outlook in the 2019 paper. Now we actually have empirical evidence for this, where we said we hypothesize that the mentalizing network will also be activated in a second person context when there's no requirement for explicit mental state reasoning. And this is exactly true. Yeah, so that's, I think, a very interesting and important finding. And then going back to the stress induction, so we basically also looked at whether or not it makes a difference for the social brain to go into a social interaction being stressed as compared to not being stressed. And we see that this is also reflected at the level of the brain. So you see areas such as the anterior cingulate cortex, so an area that has been associated with conflict monitoring, stress reactions, etc. So this region immediately comes online and is differentially activated during a social interaction, simply because you've been stressed before. Yeah, so there's sort of this carryover effect of going into a social interaction being stressed, and we are now exploring in clinical trials whether this might also be related to depression. Also to how people respond to psychotherapeutic treatment in depression, etc. So this might be something sort of that could also turn out to be relevant in the clinical context. So yeah, that much to the social brain. And then just very briefly, I'll probably skip over some of the things in the final part so we have time for discussion. I just wanted to highlight that I sort of take this notion of social interaction very seriously. And for this reason, we have established now for a number of years what we call a clinic for disorders of social interaction. Yeah, so I think there's something to be said for thinking about psychiatric disorders as disorders of social interaction. This is particularly true for autism, but it also relates to other psychiatric conditions. And I'm happy to discuss this in more detail later on. And it's also possible to turn this into a mental health service, I want to emphasize. So what I've learned is that in this clinic, I see a lot of persons who would have never come to a psychiatric hospital because they say, I don't have a mental health issue, but what you say on your website, problems in social interactions, disorders of social interaction, this is something that happens to me all the time, and it's actually making me unwell. It's making me unhappy. It's making me stressed, etc. Of course, we also see a large number of persons for autism diagnosis, etc. But I think this has, for me, has been sort of also an important discovery that describing mental health issues in terms of social interaction can actually be helpful to get in touch with individuals who might be in need of support. And of course, it also happens that we have persons who come into this clinic and where we say from a psychiatric point, there's no indication that you are mentally ill. But you can still have, of course, difficulties because, you know, there can always be situations where you meet people in the job or in other situations where social interactions don't always work out perfectly. So that's, of course, also an important possibility. And in this clinic, we use this motion tracking, for instance, to also learn more about autism. So here you can see a brief video of a gentleman who later on received a diagnosis of autism. And you can see that if you focus on this joint orienting plot on the top left, that his gaze behavior is quite different. Yeah, so he never sort of enters into this region where you establish eye contact. Yeah, and this, of course, let's say, is a very strong example of autism. So this is not always the case. In particular, because high functioning adults with autism, they learn that you're supposed to look into the eyes of another person. But with this kind of a technique, of course, we can now look more closely at the dynamics and the contingency of behavior between person A and B. And this has helped us at the group level to, for instance, demonstrate that, in fact, there are differences. Yeah, so persons with autism, which you can see here on the left in the second plot, do not engage in sort of mutual gaze as much. And this is something that by using this quantitative measure of the social interaction, we can actually also demonstrate, yeah, quite nicely. So we see these group specific differences in the gaze behavior. And we are now also thinking about how this might actually be helpful in terms of diagnostic processes, but also as a potential, let's say, marker for over time. Yeah, so when we try to support these individuals, how behavior may or may not change and how this might be related to quality of life, etc. These other things I'll skip for time keeping reasons, and just briefly also mention that we've also now developed some psychotherapeutic approaches that focus very strongly on social interaction. So in particular for adults with autism, we have this sort of manualized psychotherapy now that has been ongoing for a number of years now, and where we see that helping adults with autism to understand more about social interaction can actually be quite helpful. And many of them sort of after these kinds of group-based psychotherapies are more motivated to engage in social interaction. And interestingly, the patients tell us that it's for them very important to be in a group with only autistic adults. Yeah, so this for many of our patients is a very positive experience, that they realize there are other people just like them. And this can also be sort of a source of inspiration and also a bit of a relief to some extent. And then finally, this again speaks to this idea of social interaction mismatch, inspired by these reports by patients, which of course suggests that whether or not a social interaction works is also related to the level of similarity across individuals. We also conducted an online-based study where we invited friends to sort of participate in the study, and we asked them to report on the level of their friendship quality. So how long have you known the other person? How happy are you with the friendship? And then we also measured autistic traits, again with this autism quotient, and then asked the question whether individual autistic traits are correlated with friendship quality, and this doesn't seem to be the case. But when you then look at the difference in autistic traits across the two friends, so how similar they are in terms of autistic traits, this interestingly is strongly correlated with friendship quality, to the extent that it doesn't matter whether or not you have high or low autistic traits. What seems to be more important is whether your friends also are rather high or low on the spectrum. Yeah. So again, sort of reiterating this point that interpersonal similarity can be an important factor that influences, how happy we are or how well we feel in let's say a social interaction. I'll just leave up the summary slides, but won't read this to you. I think in detail, but hopefully, I've been able to give you some ideas about the kind of empirical research that we've done, all of which is strongly inspired, by this conceptual approach of taking the second person and social interaction seriously. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions and engage in the discussions.
Well, thank you very much, Leonhard, for this wonderful talk. So we proceed as we just decide to do it. So if someone has a very specific question for Leonhard, you can ask. I just deactivated the option, so you can just activate yourself the microphone. You don't need me anymore.
Okay. May I? Yeah, I would like to raise the question of the implications of what you say for the, let's say, the abilities required from a psychiatrist or a medical doctor, or the people have to provide health service to these people with autism or with psychiatric disorders in general.
Yeah. I think so based on my clinical experience, all psychiatrists, all psychologists, whether or not they know it or not, they're all second person experts. Because they have to be very capable of adjusting to another person, recognizing what this person's strengths and maybe also peculiarities are, what you can say and what you can't say, etc. So this I think this is a very important point, and this of course is something that you learn, I suppose, as part of your training, and there are also, let's say, formalized ways in which we discuss what we call supervision. So how easy is it for you to engage with a patient over time, etc., etc. But I also think that this is a very important question. So in psychiatry, for instance, we mostly have very boring practical reasons why a certain therapist treats a certain patient. So this is never based on, let's say, some kind of an a priori thinking about who might be the right person to help whom. But this is more a practical question. Yeah. So you say, okay, so this person has a free slot, so you go to him. Or you're on inpatient ward number 2, so this is psychologist number. I mean, this is So this is not used, this kind of an information. And also, I think in terms of the research, so psychotherapy research, I think still has a lot more to learn. Also about what's happening in these in these psychotherapies. So psychotherapy, of course, is also a more or less standardized social interaction. Yeah, and I think it would be very, very important to learn much more about this. And this motion tracking tool, I suppose, might be one additional way, or what might be one way to collect data in these situations. Yeah, so you could, from an empirical perspective, you could try to use this, and for instance, look at what features of interpersonal synchrony, for instance, which we can now measure easily, are actually related to therapeutic outcomes. So there are a few studies by Wolfgang Schacher from Bern in Switzerland, who has actually demonstrated this. So not using a motion tracking setup, but just using videos of psychotherapy sessions, where he actually shows that interpersonal synchrony, so how closely behavior is linked between therapist and patient, and how this changes over time, is a very strong predictor, for instance, whether or not the patient at the end of the therapy says, this was helpful, I feel much better now.
Great.
Oh, thank you. Someone else has, do you want to follow up, Antoni?
No, not on this. No, I think that was the complement for the. No, the other, just very brief. You didn't mention your work on the default network.
Yes. Yeah. So
you related it to this mentalizing as a default, no, for the mind, which I think is very relevant as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the default mode network, I've been interested in that for some time now, because I mean, it's of course surfaced by the seminal work of Marcus Raikle, who was sort of the first one to find out that there's this so-called default mode network, and this relates to a network that has a higher intrinsic metabolic activity. So not all brain regions have the same level of activity when people are at rest. But there are actually certain regions that have a higher intrinsic metabolic activity, which is something that you can measure, for instance, by PET imaging, where you look at glucose metabolism in the brain, for instance. And what was interesting to see, so we did analysis where, and what was interesting at first to see was that there's this high overlap between social networks, social cognition related networks, and this default mode network. So one of the first analysis that we did in 2008 was to basically systematically test whether this is just an artifact, or whether there's actual overlap between these networks. And this in fact is true. So this default mode network and these mentalizing networks overlap, yeah, anatomically very strongly, and this sort of gave rise to, I think, interesting and important speculations. Namely, one idea was to say whether this physiological baseline of the brain might not actually be related to a psychological baseline, such that people, when they don't have very much to think about, often engage in social thoughts. Yeah, so they think about themselves, they think about other people, and this is very nicely backed up by research, for instance, by Robin Dunbar, yeah, an important evolutionary psychologist who did these fascinating studies where he were standing at a bus station and then overheard people's conversations, or where they used also these so-called ecological momentary assessments. So where you ask people today via smartphones, in earlier days by these little electrical gadgets, where you give them a signal and then ask them to write down what they were just thinking about. And when you do this, you find out that people have a high probability to think about themselves and other people. So this is much more common than, let's say, other topics that may also come to mind. So one might argue that people have this tendency to think about their social relations, the social network, and Robin Dunbar, of course, argues that this is important. So sort of being an evolutionarily strongly social species, it's important to always sort of reflect upon your own role in the social network. Yeah. Who am I related to? Who's my friend? Who am I having difficulties with, etc. So he argues from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense, yeah, that our brain uses this sort of this network for social processing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So Melanie has a question, but I don't know if she's there. She asked a question on the chat. It was a question for Antoni. So Melanie.
Oh, yes, it was very kind of a small question. It was just about the concept of synchrony that came up in your talk. So apologies if this is an ignorant question due to me not understanding the topic, but you mentioned that you rejected the concept of synchrony as the explanation because it doesn't take into account the dynamics of the interaction. But I was just wondering why synchrony is necessarily an undynamic concept.
Okay, well, we have to distinguish two kinds of synchrony: behavioral synchrony from brain synchrony. There have been a bunch of studies when the Senko person approach following the 2013 paper came out that became interested in synchrony in the brain signature of being in this sort of interaction, assuming as an hypothesis that what happened in the brain was brain synchrony, that when two people interact, the activity is very similar. So they align, the term they use is alignment of the brain activity. And of course, this is an assumption. If you look in the brain, you can analyze and reanalyze, and you may try to find something that's very much similar, but it has to, it's tricky and it's not spontaneous. But more important is that in interaction, our interactions are not typically ones of behavioral synchrony. Even in imitation, the synchrony is not perfect. There is some gap. Even if I'm trying to imitate you, I'm trying to follow you in a leader-follower dynamics, or think of a conductor and a singer, or as a musician. Even if I'm trying to follow you, it's going to be a little gap. So it's not a perfect synchrony. So synchrony, just behavioral synchrony, might be just one case, a very idealized, a very exceptional case of interaction. Most cases of interaction do not consist of synchrony. They do not require behavioral synchrony, and they probably do not involve neural synchrony. We need to go beyond that. That's it.
I would agree if I may follow up on that. I think that's an important point. And in our study, if you look at the motion tracking, we also had these measures of interpersonal synchrony, yeah, which in this case we can look at different temporal lags. So we can look at perfect synchrony, but we can also look at synchrony given 1 second or 2 second delays, etc., etc. But interestingly, these measures of synchrony were not very informative, at least with regard to the subjective report. Yeah, so this didn't seem to matter to how people perceive these interactions. Yeah, which is interesting, and I would agree with Antoni. I mean, this idea of perfect synchrony, this idea of saying human beings are like pendula. Yeah, so we all sort of are perfectly aligned. Exactly, and that doesn't, I mean, from a physiological point of view, that doesn't sound very plausible. And it's also interesting that, so what might be more interesting is there's sometimes these alignment processes. So there was a recent paper out by the lab from Talia Wheatley, where they looked at, for instance, alignment or similarity in pupil behavior. Yeah, and you can see that when people engage in eye contact, so the behavior becomes very similar, pupil size becomes very similar. There's always this point where this breaks. Yeah, so physiologically, this is a state that can't be sort of sustained. it's only a beginning, a trend, and then something needs to happen. And it will be interesting to also to understand what's happening in the brain to disrupt this. Yeah. So social interaction always seems to include this element of disruption. Something changes again. Yeah. People come closer and then they break apart. And this seems to be related to physiological processes. Yeah. This is something that that our brains aren't made to sustain. And that's, I think, interesting for many different reasons.
This, if I may follow up on this, let me remind me that in the phenomenological tradition, the term they used, it was intersubjectivity. And they thought of that not in terms exactly of synchrony, but in terms of a kind of meeting of souls, not something very sort of a spiritual experience in which you feel connected to another person, and was not in terms of synchrony, they said, but was some kind of getting into something similar. And this is something I would like to ask you, and how you see your work in connection with Jasper's traditions, for instance, in psychiatry, in this humanistic and phenomenological tradition in psychiatry, and to what extent, in our view, what matters is this reciprocal contingency, this detection of how, rather than this experience of connectedness. I don't know what you think about this traditional phenomenological tradition.
Yeah, I mean, these are tough questions, but I think so. One thing that I find important from what I understand about Jaspers, which may not be so much, but I think he has this important distinction between erklären und verstehen, so explaining and understanding, that we have different approaches. So Jaspers, if I understand him correctly, he argues sort of for pluralism in psychiatry and for pluralism in the ways in which we try to understand sort of mental health. So erklären, explaining, of course, is this sort of more scientifically driven, empirical, idea of finding mechanisms that can help us to explain why things are the way that they are. But that's not all we need in psychiatry. We also need this element of understanding. So we need to, at a personal level, understand persons and their history and their subjective experience of who they are and who they've become over time. And if we don't do this, we can't be good psychiatrists. And I had a very good sort of psychiatry teacher. So the former chair of psychiatry in Cologne, he would always ask this question, so to us as junior doctors, have you understood the patient? And by this, he sort of, he meant this in, let's say, in an informal, everyday kind of way, but he also meant this sort of in a conceptual way, because he had this very strong background in psychopathology. So I think that's, that would be my attempt at understanding Jaspers. The other aspect that I find very interesting is sort of this meeting of minds or meeting of souls. This is something where in social neuroscience sort of we are learning more. Yeah. So whether communication works or not. We can now study much better. So there are great studies that coming from Uri Hasson's lab. So Uri Hasson is at Princeton, and he studies sort of two persons in a brain scanner, and he uses sort of stories. So where one person tries to tell a story to another person, and then they study whether that person has really understood what the person has meant, etc. And then they relate this to brain activity. So where in the behavior there is no synchrony or similarity, but where interestingly, when people manage to communicate efficiently, what they manage is they make their brains more similar to one another functionally. Yeah, so brain activity patterns become more similar when later on the two people who are involved say, "I really understood what you meant there." Yeah, so this This is another aspect that came to my mind with regard to this idea. How is it possible, that we communicate, and the more that I learn about social interaction across the past 20 years, the more I am surprised that it works, and at least sometimes.
Yes.
Sorry, Flor has a question. She write me private.
Yes, so. Please. Yes, please. Thank you very much. Actually, I have a general questions to Dr. Schilbach, please. Actually, that's related to your previous response that you said about the paper with similar brain activities. Okay, let me try to explain my questions like this. It relates to how to measure the sameness of the content given by the respondent, the sameness of the content. For example, when you tell me that there is a pain irritating you in the stomach, and then I respond to you, okay, I know what you mean. This response is based on my comparison. I find that experience similar to yours by comparing your experience with what I know from my mind, because I can't really reach your neural feedback. What I'm interested to know is that in any sense that we can say what I know exactly what you say, I mean, exactly your content, the sameness of the things of you. This is what I want to ask, please.
Yeah, that's a difficult question for a poor medical doctor. But what I understood is sort of you're asking, how can we be sure that one person sort of that what one person describes as the content of her mind can be sort of fully understood by another person and related to, let's say, a similar experience of pain. I think that's difficult. Uri Hasson in his lab, what they do is they use very, let's say, trivial. They use let's say, short stories, that include descriptions of certain situations, and then it's more. So it's a matter of, in the story, did the person say that the chair was blue or that the sun was shining, etc. Something like this. So where they would then say there is a level of agreement in what this may mean for different persons. So I think it depends on your definition of sameness, and how you, at least in experimental context, how you operationalize whether or not two persons mean the same thing. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's a helpful question, to be honest, a helpful answer, to be honest.
That's fine. Thank you very much. Can I have the name of the paper or the name of the institutions in the chat box?
Yes, Uri Hasson. He's if you Google his name, you will immediately find his lab in Princeton, and he has all his papers on the website.
Okay.
Maybe you might write it in the
yes,
chat.
I write it in the chat.
Yes.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
If someone else has a question. I have like two questions for both of you, but I don't know if someone else wants to ask. You can. Well, one of the questions, Diana, I think maybe you already know, is related with this the kind of interaction that people can have according to their previous history. So when I saw the graphic that you presented, Leonhard, that there were these kind of variables in the social interaction, so you can be more detached or more engaged in an emotional perspective, but there is also the history that you have with that person, so that in principle should make some kind of differences in the social interaction, right? In psychology, I think there are lots of research, well, some research, for example, I work on memory, so in memory you have this research done for like our previous supervisor with Melanie, like people collaborate together, so people who remember better if they know each other, they have certain kind of relationship. So I was wondering if both of you, so Antoni, Diana, and Leonhard, when you think about this second person perspective to understand the mind and the brain and how that interacts, so you consider also these different kind of interactions, right? because there should be differences, right? For example, the bus driver interacting with someone that I don't know, I interacted with someone that I do know, and I have a previous history. So that was a little like a topic to discuss if you want.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that's very important. And in my understanding of second person, that's really a big part of it. So thinking about social interaction reminds you that you're dealing with a process, the back and forth between human beings. And this, of course, at different temporal scales. Yeah. So I have this reciprocal exchange, let's say in 5 or 6 minutes with someone. But of course, I've had these experiences before, and all of this is shaping myself in multiple ways. Yeah. And this, from a clinical perspective, is also very, very important, because often in different, so in psychiatry, we have this distinction between axis 1 and axis 2. So we describe, symptoms that a person may have, but we also think about the personalities. Yeah. So who is that person? What has made her the person that she is? What are her tendencies? What are her traits? So what are her inclinations, tendencies to do certain things in certain situations? And often that is closely related, yeah, to the life history and the kind of social encounters, difficulties and problems that person may have had in the past. And I would argue that a second person, neuroscience or psychiatry, would try to strongly take that on board and try to understand how this plays a role, and how this also has an impact on how flexible people are in a social interaction. Yeah, what they expect from another person is often very strongly dependent upon the kinds of interactions that you've had in the past.
Yeah, I would like to add that the second person cognition, let's say, is just one part of social cognition, but that through this interaction, this second person interaction, we also developed and acquire social knowledge, the sort of situations, or the stereotypes. We may come to have an idea of who the other is, and whether these sort of expectations that regulate interaction may be more abstract, if you like, to put it so. No? If we recognize that we are in a lab, we will develop expectations about that. I don't know if I'm heard. Yes. But similarly, on the other person, on the partner, if you, I don't know, maybe in the experiments that you are doing, if they are repeated, you become more adjusted at anticipating the other person. Similarly, if you are dancing with another person, become for the first time or after many times. But both sources of knowledge are also integrated. We also took into account, but just not to deal it in the book, the cultural dimension of the expression. There might be social rules or cultural rules that make the people belonging to that culture to be more expressive or less expressive, or to avoid certain expressions or to modify them. And this is knowledge that we also have to develop through this sort of expectations. Okay.
Thanks. I wasn't wondering too much about the previous past of the person, but mostly different kind of interactions. If there are different studies that may be focused on different kind of interactions with people who know each other, and so interact maybe differently from people who doesn't really know. So it's the first time that they meet. That was a little my question. More really, not so much with the semantic knowledge that they have, the social knowledge and the norms, but mostly this kind of interaction. Because I have the impression that all the examples, at least that Leonhard mentioned about his studies, are most focused on interaction between people that they don't know each other before the study, right?
In this one study that I briefly presented, this two-person psychophysiology study, I didn't explain this very well. We had different groups of participants, and we also varied whether. So in one study we had persons who didn't know each other, so they were strangers, and they were then asked to do this task together. And in a second study, we brought in friends, so people who knew each other, and the effects that I showed you. So how strongly people's gaze behavior, was correlated. This effect is much more pronounced when people know each other, and also the decision-making agreement. So whether they can decide which target to choose, even though there is no target. All of that is much stronger for people who know each other. So that's at least one piece of empirical evidence, which tells us something about the importance, of familiarity with another person and how this impacts behavior and also decision making in such a situation.
Okay, thanks. Veronica has a question.
Thank you. Apologies, I'm having issues with my camera, but I wanted to thank you both for your talks today. And I had two questions. They're both, I think, pretty general, but I think would help me understand some of the things that you said. The first one is for Antoni, and the second one is for both of you. So the first one, when you say that second person attributions are ontogenetically basic, does that mean, I'm just wondering what the implications of that are for what we call the self. So is the self a co-constituted or constituted post a recognition of the second person? So that question. And then for both of you, you both mentioned emotions or being emotionally engaged. I'm wondering how you're defining emotion and what role or function emotion has in interaction, if it's constitutive or evaluative, or what emotions are expressive of. So thank you.
Tony, do you want to?
Do you want to answer the first question?
Briefly, in one of the chapters, in chapter 7, I think, we try to give an explanation, a conceptual explanation, trying to make sense of some developmental facts about the way in which the self also develops during, I don't know, the first 2 years of life, something like that. And the idea that the self-other distinction also develops in this kind of second person interactions, and the distinction between the self and the other is also something that in a sense is not given. There is no one of them before the other, but they both appear and develop in their complexity during this at least 2 years of life. So that's something that we don't want to say that the self is previous to understanding the self-other distinction, or that the third person or the other in interaction is previous to the interaction itself. So we try to make sense of the way in which we develop our ability to understand other people's minds, and the way in which the self-other distinction appears. It goes in parallel with the development of our abilities to understand other people's minds, or minds in general, ours and others people's minds. So both developments go hand in hand. That's the idea, at least in one of the chapters of the book. I don't know if you want to say.
We use the concept of bodily self or something like that as a starting point, and this doesn't require the baby to have the concept of self. And what we try to reconstruct how we reach the concept of self by being part of these attributions, and this notion of self can go to more abstract levels. And the second question is that emotion is a rather complex state that has several dimensions. The most important one for the interaction is that they have expression, pupil dilatation, or faces or gesture, and by body posture. Emotions get expressed, and in this way can be recognized. Of course, emotions have also psychophysiological dimension, changes in the internal activity in the brain, and also visceral, sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, etc. And not all of that is public, but there's an important part that's public. And also emotions involve some sort of awareness or conscious dimension and intentional dimension. But the critical part for the interaction is that they have this expressive dimension. As a matter of fact, there are evidence of evolutionary pressures. For instance, in our face has become more, have developed more muscle complexity, just to be able to increase our repertoire of expressive and conspicuousness of the expressive cues. So it's central for social interaction. So the idea is that these are were submitted to evolutionary pressure, just to facilitate the coordination between the members of the group.
I would agree, and I actually don't have much to add. I like this idea, and this is reflected, I think, in different areas of the literature, that we are virtual selves. We sort of become selves by virtues of others, yeah, and sort of turning these mechanisms to ourselves, and so I would, yeah. But this is just another way of reiterating, I think, the same point.
Good.
Well, someone else has a question. I don't know.
But it's almost five. Of
Yes. Well, yes. So just like a quick question, don't you think that maybe all these perspectives, like in real life interactions between adults, all these perspectives are mixed together? And sometimes, yes, we are interacting with the other and we do a kind of second person attribution, but at the same time, we just distance ourselves and try to look the interaction from a kind of observer perspective and analyze the situation from another point of view, and all that is happening simultaneously, especially because you marked that the part that was general, the brain part that was in general related with the mentalizing now is considered also that works when we don't do a kind of theory about the other, but maybe sometimes we do that in the interaction. And
I would argue that we often resort to explicit mental state attribution when the interaction doesn't work. When we notice something is not right, then we start to use these sort of more, let's say, explicit and consciously available strategies. And what I find really interesting is that, so coming back to autism, we had this naive idea that autism might be a deficit of having a theory of mind. And in my experience over many years now, this is completely untrue. Yeah. So high functioning adults with autism are probably the only group on the planet that always use a very conscious way of thinking about other people's mental states, because they don't have the know-how to deal with the social situation.
If you
so
think
it's a question of how these mechanisms, complement each other and how we can use them to get by in different situations.
Mm-hmm. But as a psychiatrist, you have to combine both levels as well, and even take into account your self-attributions. No? Notice how you are reacting spontaneously in interaction to realize, maybe to develop hypotheses or to go or to find out how to continue the conversation, or what questions to raise in the conversation with the patient.
Yes.
So of course you need to combine both, or the three of them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. So if anyone has a question, if not, we are going to finish, because as Antoni said, we already spent 2 hours and people need to go back to work.
Has been very, very nice and very generous. So we want to thank him.
Yes, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you very much for accepting to present and for exchanging ideas. And well,
and thank you to you for making this possible.
Okay. And thank you to all the participants also. So
Okay.
well,
thanks for the invitation.
No,
Thank
Exactly.
it was a pleasure.
Okay.
Well,
you.